Hey friends, this is Arie of Pups Unleashed Dog Training. Today I will be going through the steps for teaching your dog the behavior stay. Stay is a behavior that can either start with a sit or with a down. So sit, stay, down, stay. It's essentially the same behavior. The only difference is the starting position from which your dog is going to begin. Now, as far as how you use this skill, it has 1,000,001 uses. It is a skill that's really, really good for settling. It's good for developing alone time independence. And it's a very important safety cue as well, because there will likely be situations where you need your dog to stay in one spot. That way they do not possibly engage with something that is a potential hazard. So cars, other dogs, bikes, wildlife, it's just something that is not safe for them. Well, stay is a really good way to keep them away from whatever that thing is. It is a little bit of a more difficult behavior for some dogs to learn because it requires a lot of impulse control. It requires staying stationary for a chunk of time. So it is a little trickier, but it is, in my opinion, an essential skill for every pet dog to know, because it's one that can keep them safe, and it's also one that helps them build confidence in being alone, because you can teach them that good things happen not only when you're around, but also when you return from them being on their own while they're in that stay position. So it's very, very useful for that reason. Now, as far as how you would go about training this skill, there are probably more steps than most basic skills, because it is one that is a little bit more difficult for dogs to learn. So expect progress to be slower, expect to put more work in with this one and more time in with this one. But every dog can learn it. You can start teaching this to puppies, and the older they get, the better they will get. I would not expect a young puppy to be perfect at this behavior. I think it's just asking too much, but it does not mean you can't start teaching it and do little stays, short amounts of time. That way they at least have that foundation. When teaching stay, there are a lot of steps that you will go through for this behavior, more than most other basic skills. The reason for that is that it's a little tricky to get distance from your dog when most of the time our dogs are used to following us places. But that's all the more reason to actually teach this skill, because you want your dog to have that alone time independence. So the first step for teaching your dog how to stay is only getting one step away from them, which might sound super basic, but for some dogs, it does take a while for them to actually get the knack of this. So for this, you first want to decide if you are starting with a sit stay or a down stay. It really doesn't matter too much which one you pick. For some dogs, one is going to be easier than the other, but it depends on the dog. So you can try out both, and whichever one seems to be easier for your dog, go with that. I am going to describe all the skills as if the dog is doing a sit stay. If you're doing a down, you're going to replace sit with down. So step one is you put your dog in a sit, reward the sit with a treat. Then what you're going to do is you're going to show them a hand signal that looks like a stop sign. This is the hand signal that I like to use for stay. Alternatively, you can use this. Some people also use that, but if your signal for sit is pointing upward, which for some people it is, it gets confusing. So I prefer this. So you're going to put your dog in a sit, you're going to reward the sit with a treat. Then you're going to do this with your hand, put your hand down, and you're going to very quickly take a step away from your dog and back towards them again.
Yes.
If they do not pop out of their sit, then you're going to say yes when you return and feed a treat. If they do pop out of their sit, which they will probably do for the first several attempts, you're going to resit them and then try again.
Yes.
You're not rewarding with a treat the second time, because you don't want to start the game of popping up out of a sit and then getting a treat again. So you would just kind of go, and then put him in a sit again, show the hand signal, and back away. So in summary, step one is sit, reward the sit, give the hand signal, step away, and step back really quickly. Try to make the step quick, I think, because it's a skill that we're afraid the dog's going to pop out. A lot of times the natural tendency of people is to do really slow steps away and back again, but that's actually harder for the dog because it means they're in that position for longer. So quick step back, quick step forward, yes, and give that treat. Once your dog masters that step, you can make it a little bit harder. But when I say masters that step, I mean that every single time you show that hand signal and you back away and forward, they're not popping out. So until they get to that point, do not push to a harder step, because then their performance will completely fall apart because it's too hard and they'll get frustrated. The second step in teaching your dog to sit is exactly the same as the first, except you're going to try to get 2 steps away from them. You should not push on to this step until your dog completely masters the first step, which means that every single time you show that hand signal, you back away and you go back in, they do not pop out of their stay. If they do, it means they're not ready for this step, because we're just going to be making it harder and harder every time. So if they don't master the first step, they will get really frustrated at the second step. So there's no reason to try to fight through that. You want them to master the first step before you add the next one in. So for step 2, it's exactly the same as step 1, except you're going to back away with 2 steps, go back in with 2 steps. Just as before, you are doing this quickly. You're not doing ginger steps that you're wasting a lot of time. You are 2 steps back, 2 steps forward. When you get back to your dog, you say yes and you feed that piece of food. And as with step 1, you are going to do this over and over and over again until your dog is perfect at this. They're not popping out of their 2-step stay at all. Then you can push to the next step. The next step is pretty much what you would probably predict, which is adding a 3rd step to this process. And you're going to continue like this until you can get about a room's length away from your dog. So that's usually about 10 steps. It depends on the room, honestly, but a reasonable size room will be fine as far as setting your goal there, but you want to be able to get a full room's length away from your dog, all the way back in before you say yes and release that treat. As I said before, do not push to harder steps until your dog masters the step you're on. So you are making this harder 1 step at a time when your dog masters the step that they are on. Once you get to the point where you can get a full room's length away and back to your dog consistently, then you can start to add the word stay in. So what you would do is you would put your dog in a sit or with sit. Then you would say stay, show your hand, put your hand down, and then back away as you did before. So it's not really any different than the previous steps. You're just adding that word in there. Once your dog is consistently recognizing that the word stay means stay, then you can make it harder yet again. Right now, all we've done is just away from your dog and back again. You can almost think of it as a yo-yo. So it's just back and forth, straight line, and you're focused on your dog the whole time. But that's not super realistic to what it's going to be like in real life when you need to stay to work. So now you have to start to make it more realistic, which means you're going to be moving around a lot more organically than you were before. So put your dog in a sit, give him a treat, tell him to stay and show your hand, and then what you're going to do is, instead of backing away, you're going to go left or right, because our goal is going to be to get completely around your dog now. So we're moving in a curved pattern. So 1 step to the left and then back again, yes, and a treat, just like before. 2 steps and back again, treat as before. So you're slowly building up to making a circle around your dog. You can expect your dog to pop out when they get to the point where they have to crane their neck to see you. Oftentimes what you end up seeing the dog do the first few times is they pop out because they're trying to follow you with their head and then ultimately their body. So as with our previous steps, the second they pop out of that stay, you're just going to go and circle back to the beginning, and you're going to start again. For a lot of dogs, this is harder. That curved pattern is a lot harder than just going back and forward. So as I said before, expect this to take some time. And if your dog gets frustrated, it's a great time to drop down to an easier step or an easier skill and then try again later. Once you can successfully get a full circle around your dog in one direction, you're going to repeat the steps for doing this, but in the other direction. So whichever direction you do first, keep track of it and then go the other way. Don't try to switch directions halfway through as your dog's learning it, because they will get confused by that. Once you can get a full circle around your dog in one direction, a full circle around your dog in the other direction, then we will make it harder still. As far as what you do next, it actually depends on your dog and your personal preference. It's going to be harder in some way or another, but you can either start to move around in a more natural pattern. So instead of making a complete circle or away and back again, you can just start to walk around the room, start milling around. You know, maybe you open and close the blinds, maybe you open and close the fridge, maybe you sit down and stand up while your dog is in a stay. You just start to do little mundane things that you would normally do throughout the day while your dog's in that stay position. But make these trials quick. So no more than 10 or so seconds at this point, because we haven't made this a long stay yet. We're just trying to give your dog the idea. But pick some little things you can do within 10 seconds or less, put your dog in a stay, and do whatever that thing is, and then return to them, say yes, and give them that treat. Once your dog masters short stays where you're not giving them your full attention, then typically the logical next step is to start to add time to your dog's stay. So up until now, everything we've been doing has been quick. So your dog is remaining in place, but they're not remaining in place for long. Now we're going to start adding time. When we do this, you're going to move closer to your dog again. So I would not try to start adding time when you're all the way across the room as well, because that's two difficult things at the same time. So you're going to get close again, maybe only 2 or 3 steps away from your dog at first when you start to add time. And you need to be really strategic about this. So I suggest you use a stopwatch or a timer on your phone. That way you can keep track of how long these stays are. So you're not pushing too far, too fast with your dog as far as the difficulty goes. So at this step, what you're going to do, put your dog in the sit, and give them the treat. Tell them to stay, give your hand motion, and then just back away a couple of steps. 2 or 3 steps is fine at this point. And typically for the first duration stay, 5 seconds is plenty of time. So you're going to back away, you're going to wait 5 seconds, and then you're going to go back into your dog, say yes, give the treat, and repeat. You want your dog to be perfect at this 5-second stay before you make it harder. And something that I want to make note of is if 5 seconds is too hard for your dog right off the bat, make it easier. Make it 2 seconds or 1 second. It doesn't have to be a 5-second stay at the beginning. It's just typically an okay starting point for most dogs. But whatever works for your dog is what you want to go with. Once your dog masters that 5-second duration stay, then you can push to 10 seconds, 20 seconds, 30 seconds. After 30 seconds, a lot of times you can push to a minute. If that's too difficult, you know, split the difference and make it 45 seconds. And then work all the way up to a 2-minute duration stay. So your dog stays in place for 2 minutes. As you can probably guess, this starts to eat up a lot of your time. Not that it's necessarily extremely difficult, but when you are timing 2 minutes at a time for each stay and you're doing 10 trials, it starts to eat up a lot of time. So it's something that you just want to be aware of, cognizant of when you go to do a training session, because a lot of times you can do a productive training session in 2 or 3 minutes. Well, with a duration stay, you're going to be using more time. As your dog progresses and you move to later steps, make sure they're ready for those steps. And a good way to keep track of that is to think about everything in trials of 5. If 5 out of 5 times when you do a stay, your dog does it properly, it means you can make it a little bit harder. If 3 or 4 out of those 5 times they're doing it correctly, you're on the appropriate difficulty level. You should not make it harder yet. And if less than that is accurate as far as your dog's performance, so 1 or 2 or maybe none of your trials are ending productively, then you need to make it easier. It's too hard, and there's no sense in staying on a step that is too hard, especially with stay, because your dog's just going to get frustrated. Make it easier and then circle back to it. So you're slowly working up to that 2-minute stay in this step, and as far as how long this can take, it really, really depends on the dog. Some dogs think staying is the easiest thing ever because they don't have to move. Some dogs, it's really, really hard because they want to be moving. So what's important to note here is that you must progress at your dog's pace. There is no rule of thumb for how long this should take. It depends on your dog. And if it's too hard, making them keep doing it is not going to help. You need to make it easier, or you need to take a break and then circle back to it with an easier step. Once your dog can successfully do a 2-minute stay with you, 2 or 3 steps away from them, then you can start to put this all together. You can start to be across the room and then time up to a minute or 2. You can start to walk around organically for a minute and then circle back to your dog. At this point, there's just a lot of variations you can come up with on your own, but they should consist of having a longer chunk of time. They should consist of you being farther away from your dog, and they should also consist of you behaving more naturally, because in a real life situation, you're not just going to intensely stare at your dog when they're in a stay. You're putting them in a stay because you have something else to do. So you want to start to mimic that. So that also means you practice turning your back on your dog while they're in their stay, popping out of the room and then quickly back in while they're in the stay. And when you first start that, you only want to be out of the room for half a second before you come back in, and then start to build up from there, because losing visual contact with you is very, very hard for your dog if they're in that stay position. And then when you circle back to them, especially when it's really difficult, be really generous with your rewards there, because this is a hard behavior. And if they're sitting for 2 minutes, those are 2 minutes they could have been getting a lot of rewards by doing rapid fire training of any other skill. So make sure you do up the value of that reward, or the quantity of that reward, just so that they're still feeling like they are earning a significant amount of reward for the work that they're doing, because it is hard. And then from there, you just want to start to incorporate the distractions and the new settings. Just like every other skill, if you don't practice stay with distractions, it won't work with distractions. If you don't practice stay in new settings, it won't work in new settings. So as with everything else, you're going to start to generalize, and you're going to start to work with distractions. And when you go to a new situation or you add in distractions, do expect your dog's performance to drop down a little bit. So be prepared to drop down to earlier steps, up the value and the frequency of those rewards when you do end up in new situations or with distractions. And from there, you're just going to start using life rewards to really reinforce that behavior. And you have the dog that can be in a position for an extended period of time for all those reasons that we discussed. So it's definitely a skill that is worth teaching. It's worth taking the time, and it's worth being patient with your dog for it, because it's something that is really essential in the long run. When teaching stay, there are a lot of possible areas where you are going to need some troubleshooting to get over whatever that difficulty is. Because it's a complex behavior, because it's something that involves impulse control and is difficult for a lot of dogs, there's really not one particular area where you are most likely to have issues. But typically with stay, when you see a dog's performance fall apart, it has to do with moving too quickly through the steps. So for example, a common area where people will have issues is when they start to add more and more distance. So maybe your dog was great at like 2 or 3 steps, but when you're 7 or 8 steps away, they just have a really, really hard time. So when that happens, all you have to do is go back to easier steps. You go back to the last step that your dog absolutely mastered. And oftentimes what I find is that when people say that they're struggling with this, and I ask, okay, well, what step did your dog master? They don't know. And what that means is that you're not being strategic enough about it. You need to keep track at each step, especially with stay, keep track at each step of how well your dog is doing. So if you are 4 steps away from your dog, are they getting it right 5 out of 5 times? You need to know the answer to that before you consider going to the next step. And oftentimes that's what the issue is. The dog was pushed too far too fast because there was no sort of tracking of progress. And if you're going to track progress on only one skill, please do it with stay, because it's one that it's absolutely essential. And then if the step you're on is too hard, you just go down to the last step your dog mastered before you try to push forward. The other thing you can do is, if your dog absolutely mastered a step and you know that they did, and the next step is too hard, what you do is you split the difference between the 2 steps. So if your dog could do 4 steps from you, but they couldn't do 6, well, you do 5. If they could do 4 steps and they can't do 5, you do 4.5. So you just have to get creative about it. It's the same with adding time. Sometimes dogs do great with distance, but then as soon as you start to add time to the stay, it gets too hard. And again, the issue is almost always that the dog was pushed too far too fast. So you tried to start with a 30-second stay instead of a 5-second stay or a 2-second stay. If it's too hard, there's no sense in staying on that step. Your dog is not going to get it if they get frustrated. You make it easier, and then you slowly work back up, and do not be afraid to split between the 2 steps. If one step is too easy and the other step is too hard, make up your own step halfway in between. That's totally fine there. Another issue that I frequently have people report with stay is that it's not working when there's distractions. My first question there is always, did you practice with distractions? And the answer is usually no. So for your dog to stay while distracted, you have to practice with distractions. So it is one thing for a dog to stay when there's nothing else going on and you're in your living room. But it's another thing for a dog to stay when they see a dog walking past your yard. Totally different thing. You have to practice with those distractions strategically with very high value food and a lot of patience before you can really expect them to work in the real world. So as long as you're working at your dog's pace, you're dropping down as your dog struggles, and you're using high value food, you will get there. Just make sure you're patient with stay because it is one that's a little bit more difficult for a lot of dogs. In summary, stay is a skill that's going to keep your dog in either the sit or the down position, or both, for an extended period of time so that you can get some distance from them or prevent them from going towards something that you do not wish them to engage in. As always, guys, please make sure you like and subscribe, and check out some of the other videos for other essential skills that you should teach your dog. Thanks, and I'll see you next time.